On this general subject, just because for league members this is an opportunity to hear some pros and cons of different things, we could keep on with questions like, should there be controls over signature gatherers that are not? Should they have to register? Should they have to be trained? We get lots of complaints about how they do their operations. Is it the responsibility, do we want to give government the responsibility to require some kind of training? Do we want to just leave it in the hands of the people who hire them? And Mike, I'm sure you would have thoughts about that. Other questions would be, let me see what else I have. Well, that'll do for now because I also want to ask about the content, but we'll do that separately. Dan, you're looking at me. You get to go first again.
I don't see any way to police whether people actually do what they're trained to do. And as someone who sort of occasionally has been pulled into service, hey, common causes, go out and gather signatures for this thing, you know, it doesn't take a lot of training. It's a moral decision on the part of the people who sign the initiative whether they want to read it or not. So I don't see any way that a well-trained cadre of signature gatherers would lead to different outcomes than we have today.
I will comment that one of the biggest complaints I hear, and I think you all say in discussions, is we're so fed up with the person who's standing outside Target, Walmart, whatever you want it to be, with a clipboard and about 7 different initiatives on top of it. They don't know anything about any of them, and they're being paid by the signature rather than by the hour or whatever. Would you make any distinction if they're paid versus if they're volunteers? In requirement, what you might require of them?
They're almost all paid. So, you know, there are only a few.
But we're all probably
volunteers.
at one
The people
time
who are doing the lion's
exception.
share of this work are paid, and it's part of what we have done. Is we often think about the initiative process as sort of moving power from lawmakers in Sacramento to the people. What we're really doing is we're outsourcing the fundamental parts of democracy to the political private sector. We're letting people have $3 million write the agenda. We're letting people gather signatures who are paid, and we're running our public debate through 30-second TV ads. And that's what the initiative process is. And so we need to think about where the market failures are in that. But I don't see a market failure in having these people who are paid, who have no ability to compel anyone to sign these things, and have multiple opportunities for them to sign what they want. I don't see a huge problem.
Okay. Anybody with something to add? Bob looked up at me first. And then,
Isn't it ridiculous that if you can get 5% of the citizens to sign something, and you can get them to 5% to sign almost anything, that it gets on the ballot? I mean, that's just the absolute worst way to put something on the ballot. Now, the problem is, I haven't come up with a better way that people like. I had suggested just pay the state the $3 million instead of paying it to money. The state would help with our state budget, and it's going to get on the ballot anyway, so we wouldn't be bothered in the supermarkets. People don't like that. I think the internet may be a way to do it, and Mike I'm sure we get involved in that as well. I would say if you use the internet, you have to answer questions before you sign it. What is this initiative about? It's about abortion, education, so on. So you actually are signing something that you know what it's about. And also would let people say, no, I don't want it on the ballot, and so counter it that way. But we have to use modern technology. There has to be a better way of qualifying.
I feel as if I have to flip a coin between Glenn and Joe.
I would say, when you get into regulating the petition process, there have been many attempts to do it. There are 2 problems. One, we have the United States Constitution. Petitioning your government's a pretty big, important right, and when you start to mess with that, courts don't tend to like those regulations. The second thing is, when you add regulations, when you add requirements, you change the way people are paid to pay per hour, as is true in states like Oregon, Wyoming, and one of the Dakotas. Things cost more to get on the ballot. That reduces access. So if you want to do something like that, and you're worried about there being too much money in the process, too much access, you need to be thinking, again, the pieces fit together, about reducing other requirements. If you want to do something like that, I reduce signature requirements in numbers of signatures. I mean, you really need to make the pieces fit together. And another thing to know, and you should talk to Humane Society of the United States if you haven't, they're really the people who still do volunteers in a substantive amount, and they will tell you, I believe, that volunteer stuff is much more costly for signature than paying people. It's much more efficient to pay people. The reason they use volunteers is because they don't see it just as the initiative. It's part of building their organization and movement building, and they're willing to pay that extra cost. But if you advantage volunteers, you're advantaging a more costly process, unbelievably. Very true.
Glenn.
Just 3 very short. points. One is we do get into this political acceptability issue when you talk about regulating signature. A high proportion of passed but vetoed reform bills for initiative process deal with signature gathering. It's because it's perceived, whether correctly or not, as an attempt to kind of regulate and stifle the process. Secondly, I'd point out that one of the, at least in the full-fledged version of our proposal with notice and comment, it would happen actually before initiatives are submitted for qualification. And so if you could improve information and the availability of information about that, there's at least a possibility that more people know when they confront these initiatives and decide whether to sign them or not, that they know they've heard something about them, either again from their own civic awareness or from organizations that are giving them cues. The third thing I would point out is this idea I pass on. I wasn't clever enough to have this idea, but a state legislator I talked to about our idea said, well, maybe you could encourage deliberation and information by rewarding proponents who go through that deliberative process, get a lower signature requirement. And that encourages them. And that might be one way to handle this with initiatives that are not supported by the big money. But if they were willing to go through a longer grassroots informative process, they could be rewarded by an easier signature process.
I know that we have a lot to talk about in a very short time, so I'm going to have to skip over some of the things I'd like to talk about. But I will get into one of the other questions, builds on this, what do you do before everything is set in stone and people are going out for signatures? I'm going to throw several things out for you all to comment on or not if you wish. What about requiring that in some manner, by some people's standards, the content of an initiative is improved? Some people have suggested, for example, limits on the number of words in an initiative. There are also, we have at least goals for the state voter information guide, the ballot pamphlet, in terms of readability and the level of language. Should there be something like that? That's been suggested at times in the actual wording of the initiative. And then what about a pre-review before things go to circulation? It is actually one of the big kinds of bills that the League of Women Voters sponsored after our first study in the 80s, after several legislative sessions, finally passed, and it was vetoed by that governor. So those are all elements of kind of taking off from what Glenn said, and very, very quickly. Joe?
Very quickly, I don't have a strong feeling to review that. I'm going to leave that to the lawyer. But on the question of getting something that's clearer, the best solution is the Swiss solution, and that's the Swiss do this as well as anyone. We were trying to copy Switzerland when we did a bad job of it 100 years ago. And the Swiss don't let their initiative sponsors really write the initiatives. There is an office, a government office, that you have to send the thing into. They give you the language. And it's staffed by linguists. They have 4 national languages, and the justification is we speak a lot of different languages. This might work here. And we need the language to be very plain, so it means the same in every language. They have linguists, they have experts in all kinds of things, and they work with the initiative sponsor to write it. There is a sign on the wall that's, I'm told, in this office in Bern that says in German, think like a philosopher and write like a farmer. And I think that's a good principle.
Anyone else?
Sure.
Okay.
I don't think we should require readability of something that very few people actually read. Right? The initiative text is read by a few League of Women Voters members and other interested people who are non-reflective of the general California. But what we read are summaries, right? What we look at is the information. So legal drafting is very important. If you had, you can have the California Legislative Council people draft the legislature's laws, draft these, and we wouldn't be able to understand them. Legal practice.
Not lawyers.
Right, legal writing, but it's very important, right? It means something. What's really important is that we have good summaries. I think the summaries that we have now in the ballot guide do a good job of that. But also that the proponents of an initiative are on record with what their initiative does and what it doesn't do. There are things that are still unclear once you read the language that if we had something like what Professor Smith has proposed, a sort of notice and comment with an interaction between the sponsors and others, then the people who provide the things that we read, the people who provide those ballot summaries, the people who decide whether they're going to endorse or oppose an initiative, and the people who design these hit pieces that we watch on TV, which is sort of the main way we deliberate about initiatives, they would have firmer information to go on.
Thank you. Real fast, Bob.
Well, I guess I would also ask that the legislature have pre-review too. They pass bills sometimes within 1 day of being printed. And there is now a proposal that the bill has to be in print 3 days. There was one bill that went through, the amended initiative that went through in 1 week from the time it was drafted to the time it was passed. So I think that the legislature as well needs some guidance. But I guess I'm against a mandatory pre-review mainly because of this $200. I mean, I just don't want the people having to pre-review all these initiatives that come in that aren't going to qualify. I'm against now limiting the number of words. Political Reform Act, which I helped draft, 18,000 words. You all passed it by 70%. You had an idea of what was in it. So I guess I'm pretty happy with the process the way it is in terms of beforehand. I mean, after all, the initiatives that pass are written by lawyers who know what they're doing in most cases. Now, they can't always predict that something is going to be constitutional. We couldn't predict it with the Political Reform Act. A couple of our things were thrown out, dealing with contribution limits and spending limits, which the league supports. So the court said, no, you can't have that. So you can't always predict what's going to happen. But I think most of the initiatives that pass are pretty well written. Kind of hard to read sometimes, obviously, but I think that most of them are upheld by the courts. Very few are thrown out in their entirety.
Thank you. I'm going to go on and shift again, and again, this is a frustrating conversation in some ways because I keep bringing up topics that may be counter to some very good points that the panel has already made, but because we are as a league looking at certain issues, and because I think some of what you've raised needs more talk, here we go. One of the ideas is, I did want to mention, and maybe just elaborate, that as Bob said, both the legislature and the legislative process and the initiative process can put propositions on the ballot. And one of the people who's spoken out about reform of the process is this Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg, who in November, I think, or early December, had a list of 5 or 6 proposals that he is suggesting we will see soon in some form, in bill form. And one part would be to let the legislature put their measures on the ballot with a simple majority vote in both houses. As it is now, we've got bond measures, for example, that need a 2/3 vote. Constitutional amendments that arise in the legislature need a 2/3 vote. Generally speaking, if an initiative is written that allows the legislature to, well, no, I've got a bad example. They also need supermajorities if they want to amend without going to the people. But his proposal would be let the legislature put things on the ballot with a majority vote. Quick answers. Joe?
We should. I must confess to having long conversations with Mr. Steinberg about this. So I think it's an excellent idea. I wish it was actually more of a formal counter proposal where the legislature could counter propose and put things right on the ballot next to the initiative. That actually gives voters more choice. Now we've heard from that about the deliberative poll and which even though my think tank that I'm affiliated work with, I observed it, I did not, I'm not sure I bought it as a great model of deliberation, but that's a whole other story because I've just been bad now. Having a counter proposal on the ballot, so if you're a voter in Switzerland, or if you're a voter in Germany, or in certain kinds of initiatives in Washington State, you often you actually have a choice between measures. You're given the initiative, the counter proposal, if you're in Switzerland or Germany, a third choice of, if both of these pass, which do you prefer, which allows the person who opposes both to decide which one they find least offensive. That gives voters a lot more choice, and when you sort of math game it out, you're going to get a choice that's much closer and more representative of what people want than what we have. I think that counter proposal, and I think there's something valuable about having counter proposals, an initiative and a counter proposal, because that becomes a comparative campaign. The natural question for media, for voters to ask, is not their feeling about the issue, which is the sort of area in which most of our debates occur, but what's in these two things and what makes them different. And that takes you into a conversation about what's in the initiative and maybe what the unintended consequences might be. That's a much healthier conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this goes back to this value of representation. The problem for me with the direct democracy is not that $3 million buys you the route to the ballot. It's that it buys you the ability to set the agenda. Suppose the voter is right here, and the average voter is right here in the middle. If the old policy is over here, the new group that has $3 million can just be a little bit better, all the way on the other side of the spectrum, just be a little bit better than this old policy. And they're going to win if they're the only agenda on the ballot. right? But if the legislature, which is designed to represent this median voter, can, through a simple majority, which allows that middle of the legislature to choose what's on the ballot, they can come up with another proposal that's closer to what the voters want, and voters will have that choice, and I think that'll give us better representation.
Let me add something else to the mix, and then I have a feeling about it, letting what to weigh in. But another aspect of possible legislative involvement is the indirect initiative, which we all hear about quite a bit. Steinberg's proposal about that was described this way. I think this was from the Sacramento Bee paraphrase. A cooling off period after signatures are submitted. It would give the legislature a time, they say 45 or 60-day period, to review an initiative after it qualifies. During that period, the lawmakers and initiative proponents could negotiate changes with the aim of having a version acceptable to the proponents, pass the legislature, be signed into law, and then that would allow, in this one version of it, the initiative not to ever go on the ballot. It's another tweak to the kinds of things we've heard here with a couple of competing ideas. And this was the other thing that the League sponsored back and was not successful. This one is a constitutional amendment, and it just never made it through the legislature, so the voters never got to see it. I'm going to ask Bob, because he was about to say something about this whole picture.
Well, and the process you described on indirect is pretty much what our recommendation was, both in the Speaker's Commission and also in our book. Remember one thing, if we give the legislature the right to put measures on the ballot by majority vote, we're going to be voting on more measures, because there'll be more measures on the ballot. I would say, yes, maybe majority vote, but the governor should be able to have to sign. Right now, the governor doesn't have to sign putting a constitutional amendment on the ballot. I think the governor should be required to sign. So just remember, if you want more measures on the ballot, if you do, then give the legislature the right to do it by majority vote.
Thank you. Glenn, do you have a comment?
My general comment would be that I think we all admit that we can over-romanticize the legislative process in the extent to which it is representative and fair and all that. But there are some systemic advantages, including compromise and amendment and learning through the process and all that. So in general, I think anything we can do to bring more of a legislative presence into the initiative process and unify the two together is a good thing. I always think Joe's right about trying to unify them. And I just think there's another advantage, even in having this indirect idea or having the legislature weigh in, is the legislature at least can have hearings, and that, again, can enhance the information that's available to voters.
Just 10 seconds of informational. When we had indirect initiative like that in California report, no one used it. The only place in the United States that has had a successful and durable and often used indirect initiative is Washington State. They have two kinds of initiatives for the people, initiatives for the legislature. I would urge you to copy them if you do the proposal.
A 10-second correction. The reason we didn't use it in California was that the legislature was only meeting every other year, and you had to turn in the petition 2 years before the election. So don't look at the California experience and indirect, but look at Washington State and other places as well.
Thank you. We've talked, and this is just to pick up again on what one of the panelists at least mentioned, the question of amending the Constitution by initiative, and I might even throw in by legislative proposal. Do you like the system that we have now? It takes a 2/3 vote for the legislature to propose a constitutional amendment, and then once that proposal goes before the voters, it's a simple majority of the voters, just like any proposition. Would you suggest some states, there are things like it has to be voted on twice before it takes effect, or some supermajority of the voters, or any of those good ideas? Are they
yes,
mixed
yes,
bag or
and
bad?
yes. No, it's time to bring greater awareness to the idea that even the California Constitution ought to be a broad framework, relatively unamenable to change, and it ought to be a structure in which all kinds of statutes and regulations and policy changes and court cases do the modification and the heavy lifting. So I think that it's really important that it be harder and require more deliberation over time and a supermajority. I'm afraid I think the federal model is a good model.
Pat?
I agree with Glenn, but with the following grammatical change. The California Constitution ought to have been a short document, but it's not. That train left the station 100 years ago when we allowed the voters to amend the Constitution through the initiative process. So now we've had 500 of these amendments, and Joe argues very persuasively in his book and his discussions that California is governed by ghosts. And the decisions in the past are too inflexible. This would be giving those ghosts another electoral advantage because it would take 2/3 to amend what they've done.
Yeah, let me say, actually, when I make this proposal, I have to say, except where the original amendment to the Constitution was adopted by a one-shot majority, then I think you have to allow the same process to undo it or to change it. And I know that makes it much more complicated, but I agree with you.
I'm going to throw another aspect into the mix, and this is only related perhaps because it's the legislative power to do something regarding initiatives. But there are a couple of other questions that come up a lot are, as I believe I mentioned, an initiative can only be amended by another vote of the people unless the initiative wording itself gives the power of amendment to the legislature. And usually those are written with a supermajority, 2/3 or even a 3/4. Do you think that's a good idea, or should the legislature in some manner, maybe after passage of some amount of time, be allowed to amend initiatives? And then I had something similar. Let me see what it was. Sunsets. Should there be some kind of requirement that any initiative or initiatives of some certain types would sunset after a given number of years if they're not put back on the ballot, or perhaps re-adopted by the legislature? I've forgotten who should have a turn. I think it's Bob.
Well, I already talked about sunsets. I don't believe in sunsets. But in terms of legislative amendment, the Public Reform Act was the first one to allow the legislature to amend. 2/3 vote, had to be in print 10 days, has to further the purposes. 2/3 of statutory initiatives now let the legislature amend them, usually by a supermajority vote. If you said that all initiatives would have to let the legislature amend them, guess what would happen? They would all be amending the Constitution if they didn't want the legislature amending them, thus going against what we want, which is not to increase the Constitution. By the way, the Constitution is so big, as Dad said, we banned gill nets in the Constitution, ridiculous. But remember, we also set up a redistricting commission in the Constitution, not ridiculous, and it barely passed, 51% of the vote. If it required 2/3, we would not have a redistricting commission. Now, would there be a redistricting commission in the U.S. Constitution? Of course not. But because the Constitution is the way it is, we have so many things in there that it's not really a Constitution.
I mean, I think to this conversation the last 5 minutes shows why you can't do initiative reform in itself, because you have to fix the Constitution first and make it a much shorter, simpler document with some sort of revision before I mean, that's got to be part of what you're doing. But to this question of changing the statutes, I mean, I think sunsets can make some sense. That's one way to do it. It doesn't have to be that way. But allowing legislative amendment, if you can look around the country at initiative statutes, you look around the world, I even sent a probe into deep space, and there is no place in the universe where that is as inflexible as us on this. And I know it's hard to sell to people, but I think the hard fact, you can go on ballotpedia.org and look at the list of all the other states. Everyone else allows the legislative body to change. Sometimes it requires them to wait a couple of years. Sometimes they have to have a supermajority. But everyone else allows fixes. And even in those places, there's not a sea and a run of people trying to reverse what the people did. That the people voting does have a lot of force, particularly when you win. It means that there's a majority of voters out there who want that thing. And I think in the ability to stitch policy together, that's a core thing. Even if it's politically hard, it's worth fighting for some sort of regime that allows the legislature, maybe after some time or certain conditions, to step in and fix things.
Thank you. Thad, you may have the benefit of any last comment, and then I would like to go to audience questions.
Let's go to audience.
Okay, you're going to have to answer some of them anyway.
It's your voice.
As somebody who's been in the weeds about so many of these proposals, it's killing me that I don't get to ask this group of wonderful panelists what they think about a number of things. We haven't talked about campaign financing, and a lot of disclosure bills will be in the legislature this year. Lots of other topics. Watch the news, read your study guide. I think it'll be a fascinating constitutional amendment kind of initiative versus one that's statutory. And for example, why are gill nets in the Constitution?
Yeah, the proponent decides. They get 5% of the signatures, it's statutory. If they get 8%, it's constitutional. And why the gill nets? I mean, that was in 1990. A legislator actually is the one who circulated, Doris Allen, and she said she did not want the legislature to mess around with it. She wanted to have constitutional protections. She wanted the courts not to mess around with it, so she put it in the Constitution. It was just the most absurd thing to go in the Constitution I can think of.
And there's a dark history in California. We had a constitutional provision that kept the Chinese from fishing for over 50 years.
And then, of course, as you pointed out, our Constitution has some good points too. We have rights enunciated in our state Constitution that are not explicitly enunciated in the federal. So how do we keep the good and clear out the
Yeah,
bad?
without having them changed by initiative.
Hi,
Next.
Tom Reed. I have a question. We see the legislature put these proposals out, like Prop 30 and stuff. If the panel would comment on how would we get a counter proposal against one of the legislative proposals to balance it, much the same as the legislature wants to balance the private citizen.
And I'll comment. The question was, we see things like Prop 30 that that it was legislators who were behind. How would the people have the ability to make a counter to something that comes from a legislator? And one of the things that I think most of the public didn't recognize was that Prop 30 was an initiative. It was, the proponent was the governor and other people with him, but he went to the initiative process, and in this case, because he wouldn't have been able to get the required vote in the legislature, so he couldn't do it through the legislature. Any comments? I've kind of opined.
When the legislature goes to the ballot through the compulsory referendum process, they're doing it because we've said there's some things that are just so big that we don't trust the legislature to do it on their own. Amending the Constitution, too big for them to do without us having a check, and getting the future generations through a bond. So that's what the legislature is bringing to us, and they need to get 2/3 in both houses. So what we see is those are these consensus measures that don't have big campaigns, the spending on them is very low, and they pass about 70% of the time. Whereas the things that voters put on the ballot or individual citizens through the initiative process are the big ones that generate the expensive campaigns and pass only 30% of the time.
There's something in that question that speaks to a certain American and Californian hypocrisy, which is that, I mean, it's never discussed here really, it's just become a fact of life, but when a governor or a legislator does it, there's an aspect of a plebiscite to that, and when Hugo Chavez puts things on the ballot in Venezuela, we tisk, but when a governor, and that's an abuse of executive power, when a governor of California does it, that's a fine thing and a way to get things through. Now, certainly the larger context is different, but I do think, it's not been part of your questions or conversations, but there's a case to be made for not letting elected officials be. The elected officials could be the one class of people who shouldn't be able to put things on the ballot.
By initiative. By initiative.
By initiative, yeah.
Not by.
Not by initiative, yeah.
If there are no other comments, I'm looking for a hand. In the front row?
The Constitution, our Constitution. Several of you have mentioned that it would be a good idea to fix the Constitution if we could, along with working with the initiative process. I understand that takes the Constitutional Convention. How does that work? How come it didn't work the last time we tried it? How come we're not doing it again?
The reason it didn't work the last time you tried it was because it was 152 people and they were all men.
Did the audience all hear, this is why would a constitutional convention not work?
And I'll pander worse than that. If we do it again, we should only allow women. I mean, it's just hard. It's hard to do. We keep trying to change the Constitution. We have this illusory initiative process that allows us to change the Constitution, but it's really hard to change the document because it's in a way that you intend, because it's so complicated. It's like it's throwing another formula onto a big group of formulas. Now, a convention can be called. It takes 2/3 of the legislature to ask the public, the voters, to vote for it, majority vote. The convention happens, and then their whole product, not the little pieces, but their whole product goes on the vote, goes back to the voters for majority up or down vote. That's the constitutional process. It doesn't have to be that way. The legislature could constitute itself as a constitutional convention, or you could they could empower a revision commission whose product would go to the voters in a package. But I just think there's so many things wrong, you can't do it one at a time. Initiatives are poison because they're one separable at a time. You need to do multiple things and try to stitch things together. In California, almost everything individually we do, we can make a justification for it. That's why Bob can say, hey, what would the voters take back? But the pieces, while they could justify each decision they made, the overall doesn't work very well. And I can't help but adding, I mean, that, voters is a problem in this, and voter education, voter knowledge. I mean, if you had a person who you could say of what was true of what Bob said of the elector as a whole, a person who believed they had never made any mistakes is not a person I would want making decisions for me.
Let's see, it's there on about the fourth row. Yes.
How can you get rid of Prop 13?
The question was, how can you get rid of Prop 13?
An initiative. But let me tell you, every poll shows that Prop 13 would pass by just as much today as it passed in 1978, so good luck.
Yeah, you couldn't get rid of Prop 13 as an initiative. It's become, so many things have been built upon it by left and right. It was probably a revision in the first place, but it's certainly to mess with it now. I mean, the way you do it is by constructing something new, and I had a piece in the Sacramento Bee last week that just argued that the first rule of beating Prop 13 should be like the first rule of Fight Club. Don't talk about Prop 13. Talk about the broken system that we have and how you're going to fix it.
And I'll say it's on the internet under sacb.com. Look under opinions.
And I'll just add that the other rule might be that you don't try to repeal it directly, but that there have been a number of initiatives that have changed it, modified it, tried to save it or whatever. And then court cases. And this is another thing we haven't really talked about, but we pass these initiatives, they're like legislation, and then in court, judges have to decide how to interpret them, how they apply to situations that may or may not have been anticipated by the drafters and the voters. And there have been a number of cases, dozens of cases that have interpreted Prop 13, and in many cases to take off some of the rough edges on it. So if an initiative that some of us look back on and think that's a bad initiative and it would be a response to Bob's question, we don't always have to simply repeal it. There are, as the modification of 3 strikes through initiative shows you, initiatives can be used to improve bad initiatives in the first place, or ones that went in ways that were not anticipated, and so can court cases. So again, it's Joe's point that we look at initiatives, that's our focus for today, but it's part of a broader system of interaction between various elected officials, interest groups, citizens, and it's a part of a whole process.
Thank you. We have time for several more questions, I think, in the second row, and I apologize. I'll hit the back next. It's hard for me to see you.
I think I have kind of a two-part question.
Very loud if you're able.
I think it's a two-part question. You mentioned, I think, hit pieces. I think of a hit piece as something negative, disingenuous, and not truthful. So how do you define a hit piece, or what would you say it is? And then how do you educate the public to spot and analyze one?
I would like to repeat that, just so everyone hears. The questioner asked, when we're talking about hit pieces in campaigns, how do you define a hit piece? Is it something negative, not truthful?
Well, I think of it as, I just want to say, I think of a hit piece as something that's negative, disingenuous, and not truthful. And then, so my question would be, how do you define a hit piece? Or what do you say a hit piece is? And I'm thinking in terms of it's not quite truthful. How do you educate the public to spot one and to analyze one?
And so the second part was, how do you educate the public on how to spot and analyze one?
So I may have been using that a little bit more loosely because I think California's campaign ads are actually pretty informative. You can actually learn a lot about initiatives. Most of them are truthful on initiatives because there are lots and lots of systems to call people on that. The newspapers do a good job with ad watches, and even though people don't read these ad watches that are buried on page 7, the other campaign, if they're well funded, can come up, can run an ad saying, look, we don't think the other side is truthful. I think there are a lot of checks on the process, and one of the things that political scientists have learned with lots of studies of the initiative process is that despite, but probably because of all the money that's spent, the hundreds of millions of dollars per election that's spent telling you so-and-so likes this initiative, so-and-so hates this initiative, this is why we're doing this initiative, this is why you should vote no, the public gets a good idea of what these initiatives are and makes a decision that is representative of what voters want. And so, I could talk about what these studies show, but the general picture is we are buying, with all this money that's spent in democracy, a lot of information for us, and I don't think that's entirely a bad thing.
Well, I happen to think the voters are fooled into defeating initiatives. They're not usually fooled into passing initiatives. And the interesting thing in terms of ads, a candidate can lie, and there's nothing you can do about it in a TV or radio ad. An initiative campaign may not lie. You can go to the TV or radio station and say, that is a lie, take it off the air, and they will take it off the air. We did analyses at the Center for Governmental Studies several times in the last few years on all the elections. We didn't find one initiative that lied. We did find initiatives that were misleading, that weren't quite as accurate as they would be, but they didn't lie. So keep that in mind. But as I say, the problem is, I think, that the campaigns will fool people into voting against initiatives, because when you're confused, you will vote no.
And I don't think we have time for answers to this, but maybe I'll rephrase the second part of that question. How do we educate the public and ourselves to recognize and analyze the misleading in advertising?
Let me take a slight variation on that question, ties into the last point, which is, I think that's, again, one of the advantages of having a process by which formally initiative sponsors talk about what their initiative does and doesn't do, what laws they seek to overturn and not overturn, is because that can then become fuel for the ads. People, if you know that if you say something that's both politically unacceptable or legally dubious or whatever, that's going to be used in an ad and it's going to be attributed to you, there will be a lot of more forethought about how to do initiatives, and also the public will have more information about the initiatives. So I think that it all fits together, but it could lead to more information and giving the public and people like the League and other groups that help the public watch for things and understand things and see downsides, appreciate that.
And I would just say, I think what we need to think about, and this is building an infrastructure, citizen-led infrastructure of deliberation and participation around this process. I mean, you're not gonna, it's a free country, we newspaper people are careless and in a hurry. You need to build other structures. Oregon is doing that. Oregon has something called Citizens Initiative Review. It's a jury, 24 people. They hold a hearing, brought together, hold hearings, listen to all sides on an initiative, publish very short, one page. There's regular people writing themselves, summary of what the thing actually does and the best arguments for and against it. That goes in the ballot pamphlet. I can see a process like that being used for many initiatives, being used in other ways, being even used to write titles and summaries, and that sort of thing. I mean, building an infrastructure that can compete with all the sort of, for a better use of the word crap that it's fed to us, is probably the best shot we've got.
And I hate to move from crap to the back of the audience, but we'll just go part way back. Yes, please, you.
Yes, you talk, all of you talk about educating the public. However, I've been to a number of the pros and cons on ballot issues, and they do not disclose their stand on the propositions. And I just wanted your comments about educating a public when you yourself do not disclose what your advocacy position is.
I'll repeat the question. In terms of all of our talk about educating the public, she's been to many League presentations of the pros and cons of the ballot measures, and in those, the League member giving the presentation doesn't disclose our stand on some of those measures. Anybody who's a League member want to speak? Or okay,
I have a big problem with the League taking positions on ballot measures because you put out these nonpartisan guides. So I think you shouldn't take a position on them. However, I think the most important thing that voters look for when considering a ballot measure is who is supporting and who's opposing the measure. We want to know, does the Sierra Club support or oppose it? The Chamber of Commerce support? And that's why I say there should be a page added to the ballot pamphlet for each proposition, who is supporting and who is opposing. And I think that would be the biggest help that all of us could get.
Our time is short.
Yeah, just briefly, I agree with that, and I mean, I speak to League, and you can ask, I'll tell you how I vote on these things. I haven't voted yes on a balloted measure in at least 5 years. No, didn't vote for any of it. I take a first do no harm approach.
I will take the privilege of the chair, if I may, and as a longtime League member and one who does work on our advocacy on ballot measures. The League of Women Voters mission is both supporting the informed and active participation of citizens in government, of people in government, and influencing public policy by both education and advocacy. What we are very careful to do, and you see this replicated at the national and certainly our state level and local leagues, is keep to the best extent possible those two parts of our mission, the education and the advocacy, separate. You'll see it at the state level by the fact that we now have a cavotes.org ed fund website where you'll see our pros and con material, and on the LWVC.org website that I mentioned, you'll see only those measures on which we've had positions that we could apply to our analysis of the measures, and you'll see our recommendations. Different leagues handle the question of do I cite the league's position or not differently. None of them feature it and make it prominent because they really want to be able to in a fair way present both sides. Some of them will at the end of a measure, or if they're at the end of a program, or if they're going through all of the pros, supporters and opponents, they will list the league with it. They just try to fit to their community what they need to do. I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. Our time is just about up, and I see Mary coming up to the stage. I apologize for those of you who did not get to ask a question. Certainly, you know there's an ongoing discussion, and we'd love to have you be part of it.
I'm Mary Thompson. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of North County, and I am so thankful that you are all here today. I think Thad said we just might make a difference by the fact that you are here today, and I'm sure of it. I think the insights about this powerful tool that's in our hands is going to, that we got today, these insights, is going to forever change the way you look at a ballot measure in the future. We're glad that you took the initiative to be here today. On the back of your program, you're going to see some of the people that were responsible for today's event. Not listed, but really terrific, is the library. I mean, this is a great venue, and we're so thankful for Lester and his intercession. Special thanks also go to our media partners, Lola Sherman of the UT North County Times, and Jared Whitlock of the Coast News. We're also pleased to have today this event being videotaped thanks to Citizens Oversight. We hope to have a link up on our sites shortly. Before you go, we would appreciate your comments on the back of or on this pink feedback form. Our goal is to provide future forums, and your thoughts will help us plan. Thanks for coming.